Hey, everybody. Welcome back. This is really exciting. I have been trying to talk Trace into this for, it feels like a long time. So if you're here, you're in for a treat. I came across her TEDx talk years ago and immediately sent out a request. Didn't know anything else. I didn't know anything else about her. And then since then, she has sort of gravitated into my orbit, and I now see her all the time, which has been such a treat. And so stick around to hear the formal introduction of this week's guest. Today's guest is a relationship strategist and speaker specializing in transformation, change management, and culture. Her TEDx talk, Why You Should Regularly Talk with Strangers, champions the power of human connection and has been translated into 15 languages, demonstrating her global impact as a thought leader. She takes a neuroscience-based approach, challenging others to embrace change, weaving together a tapestry of courage, vulnerability, and empathy. As a transformative advocate, her work is rooted in the belief you can't fix what you're not willing to face. Fun fact, she initiated the now standard practice of Starbucks writing drink orders on the cups. She shares that story in The Performance Paradox, a book written by Eduardo Briceño. Please join me in welcoming Traca Savadogo. Hello, Traca.
Hi,
Welcome.
Robbie.
I'm so happy to have you on the show. And as you know, it's a show at Building Strong Networks, and the context is leadership. So tell me, how do you define leadership, and when did you realize you had the skills to lead?
Well, I think building the skills to lead has been something I've worked on my entire life.
Hmm.
The desire to lead and the desire to get stuff done, that has always been in my wheelhouse since I was a little kid. Like, I was a champion Girl Scout cookie seller. I started a camp in my backyard in the summer when I was a kid, and in fact, it was a horseback riding camp, and I was like, we'll worry about the horses later. So I've always been a champion of trying to move ideas forward and learning how to build teams, learning how to even get my message across, get heard, get buy-in, and connect with the right people to help advance an idea. That's been an ongoing journey from day one.
So what does leadership mean to you then?
You know, I love that you're asking that question, because what's happened for me recently is more introspection. I used to be very outward focused on bringing people together, getting ideas, moving them together, in a number of different ways. And we can probably talk about that later. But what I'm really focused on right now is the inner landscape and leading myself. So I'm a big fan of a guy named Jerry Colonna, and one of the things that he talks about is, how have I been complicit in creating the conditions that I say I don't want?
I love that phrase because I had a hard lesson to learn, and I've had to learn it more than once, that I am the arbiter of my own schedule. And I was just out with someone the other day who was talking about how much they had to do and how they didn't have time. And I said, "Oh, are you in charge of your schedule?" Because I mean, some people aren't, right?
Yeah.
And he said, "Yes." And I was like, "That's
Yeah.
not a negative. That's a, you now realize that, and you can now make some decisions, right? Like, don't be complicit in the things you complain about." That's, yeah, I love that. We'll put a link to that person in the show notes so others can explore that as well. I appreciate you also just sharing a little bit about who you were as a kid. None of it's surprising to me, because it's how you kind of show up today. Like, you're vivacious and you're a connector and you're great at building relationships. So I imagine like you as a kid on the playground, like organizing kids to do various things. I wouldn't have come up with a horseback horse, camp in your backyard, particularly given that you didn't have horses. But tell me, like, how you showed up when you were younger, how you saw yourself, and how others, like particularly like the adults in your life, how did they perceive you? Were you sort of pushed forward to the front of the room to take on leadership? Did you run for student office or club activity president or sports president or anything like that?
I think people tried to push me forward in some ways. like teachers tried to get me to go, but there was that inner thing that was, in my household, there was a lot of, my mom was a very nervous person. She never wanted to stretch. She had a turbulent upbringing. And so her goal was, I just want everything to be copacetic. That was her word. And my dad was very much like, rebel without a cause and caused a lot of disruption that she then had to clean up or deal with, or that the family was impacted by. And so there was this, doubt and fear and anxiety in me. But then there was a conflicting desire to like, oh, if you can't do it, I will. Or I have an idea, this is how we can make it better. Like I have a strong commitment that I can make things better. And that I think is, as Tamsin says, the red thread. I truly believe that I have the ability to spot something and also make it better. And I'm willing to do the work to try and make that happen. And so that's where my networking piece came in. It was like, oh, okay, well, who do I need to talk to make this happen? And like, as a little kid, I was writing CEOs of companies and, sending out letters. And I had no problem making a phone call or whatever. My dad was a salesman. And so he's like, you got a problem, like go talk to the right people. And that was very helpful.
Well, first, we have a shout out to Tamsin Webster. We'll put a link to her great work and her book, Red Thread, in the show notes. And, you're reminding me of me a little bit. Like, like I was a kid who heard early days of high school, like when I think I was in ninth grade, that they were thinking about starting a polystyrene recycling in the school. And I happened to have multiple lunch periods that year in a row every other day. And so I heard this message 3 times from the assistant principal. And by the third period, I was like, okay, well, we're just going to do this. And I did some research and I found out who the hauling company was. And I called them and they put me through because I was a kid
Yeah.
in the district. And it was such a unheard of thing that like I got to talk to who I didn't even know the president, CEO, whatever the phrase was. And then I was like, my assistant principal wants things to happen. Would you meet? And so I got the two of them to meet past all the red tape. And I didn't understand. I sat there not understanding the level of conversation that was happening above my head. But I then became the spokesperson who helped teach everybody how to like implement this program. And we did it. We have the largest largest district in our region. So us setting that in motion like has the ripple effect. And so it was one of those things, like you said, like you don't really even know yet what the barriers are because you haven't been told not to. And I also have a mom who sees danger and a dad who's like, oh, the way you work around that is. So having both those voices in your head can really, if you can find that line between, so you're not being disruptive all the time, but you're not being cautious all the time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, that's also been something that's been really interesting to me about. I would love to teach kids how to leverage the power that they have. They have a lot more power and a lot more access and a lot more learning opportunity very much younger, because when kids reach out, people are really impressed. I'm like, who is this person?
Yeah.
And I think it's so important, and it's a skill set that a lot of people don't cultivate. I remember my dad trying to get me to stop doing some of that stuff. And yet, it was a pathway into learning and growing. And it was as my friend calls it, she's like, it's a free pass, like they'll open the door for you. You just got to knock on it, especially when you're younger.
Did you tend to go outside systems then and not like you weren't trying to become the president or the leader of a group? You were more the advocate on the outside, writing notes and getting calls and, sort of letting your voice be heard? Or were you organizing other kids to do the similar thing? Like, how did you sort of galvanate some momentum around that?
I think that I didn't, because of the way that my family was structured, I didn't understand systems, right? So I didn't know how to work within them. And ultimately that turned out to be a really good thing, because I was just like, I don't understand, why don't you just call them? Like, and I would. And so there's a really like a classic example of this is that I was having a dinner party with this guy who ran an underground illegal restaurant before pop-ups were a thing, and speakeasy style. And we're all staying there late after all the guests have left, and I we're having this conversation, and I was like, who would you love to have for dinner? And this guy said Anthony Bourdain. And at the time, like, he gushed. And at the time, I had no idea who he was. But I went home that night and I looked him up on the internet, and I was like, well, that was super fun. Let me invite him. And then the producer got a hold of that email, and then they decided they were going to come out and film the show. And so I told the chef, and he like lost his mind. And I was like, yeah, but your house is kind of a dump. We can't do it here. So I was like, okay, well, where can we have this event? And I contacted a friend of mine who is a foodie, who is also an architect. And I said, do you have any clients who would like to host a show with Anthony Bourdain at their house? And he's like, let me make a phone call. And that's what we did. And so, that, like, okay, what do you want to see happen? Like, let's see what we can do. And it's amazing what happens when you even try.
That's an amazing example of who you are, because going from, oh, well, that seems to really excite you, let me find out what to do and not be afraid to ask and see where it goes. And you're doing this as an adult. Like, you've kept that piece of that heart that I think kids can really bring to the conversation, that a lot of times we kind of lose that momentum, that energy as we get older, and we start to constrain ourselves, our enthusiasm, our wish lists get smaller and more realistic, quote unquote. So did you do like anything early in life that made you think, this is what I'm going to be when I grow up? Like, when you were 12, did you have a sense of what your trajectory was going to be? Was it laid out to you by family or by expectations or by a passion you had, or were you still trying to figure that out?
Technically, I think I'm still trying to figure that out. No, actually, there were no expectations in my household as far as get out of the house. We want you to leave. Like, the kids need to leave the house, kind of a thing, and we want to get on with the next chapter in our life. And so it was very much a blank slate and a lot of trial and error. And I think that kind of ties in with my curiosity conversations, is I would get curious about a field, or I'd have a conversation with somebody and they would offer me a job, and I would take it, and then have to figure out how to manage that. And so, for instance, like out of high school, I had a couple different jobs, but one of them, I got hired as a salesperson selling shoes. And the guy had, in the back of our room, he had steps on how to sell, and like Zig Ziglar sells tips or something like that, and I read them 42 times a day. And then I became the number one salesperson out of a chain that had 300 stores. And they're like, oh, well, let's bring her down to our flagship store. Let's, she can manage this store. Either she could turn it around, or we're going to close it. So it created some opportunities, but it was me following my curiosity. And then, and every step along the way, I was like, oh, I really like changing things. Let me get into politics. I ended up like interning with the 1st Congressional District of Washington State. And then at the time, I interned with the World Affairs Council, because they were doing more like global think tank stuff. And then I got really interested in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was having their conference in Seattle. And I was like, well, of course I'm going to get involved with that. And I got involved. I ended up being the right-hand person to the person that organized all the events that were open to the public, 5 days of like events that had 1,200 people. And we planned for months and months and months. And then, I don't know if you remember this, but that was Protest Central and the Battle of Seattle. And one night our event was like locked down. There's police security guard outside and tanks, and I'm on CNN. I call my mom and dad and I'm like, don't worry, we're fine. It looks worse than it is.
I know people who were on the protest side of the battle in Seattle, 1990s, right?
It was
Yeah.
crazy. And, but I love that that's part of my lived experience, right? And so my journey is more about following curiosity, right? And so even in college, I went to college late. So I had the shoe career for the sales career first, and then I went to college. And in college, I was in student government. That was the first time I had a official leadership role. And I was also one of 2 students for a college that had like 24,000 students that was on the all college campus. So I met with the leaders of the college every month. And I was also in Model UN because I wanted to change the world. And we would go to the New York conference, the big UN Model UN conference every year in New York. And one year we got Cuba, and I was like, you guys, we can go to Cuba. Let's go to Cuba. And at the time, like artists, students, athletes, and journalists were the only people allowed in Cuba. And my professor was like, there's no way. There's like protests happening in Cuba all the time for the return of Elian Gonzalez. Yeah, I don't know if you remember that. It was like in the middle, they were protesting all the time. And I was like, well, I'm in student government. Let me see what I can do about this. And for spring break, we took 12 students to Cuba. So I'm like, who says we can't do this? Let me at least try.
I just say, once you get a rhythm with those kinds of possibilities coming to reality,
Yeah.
you really, the naysayers are just like little bugs buzzing in your ear, and you're like, oh, yeah. Like, tell me what the problem is, and I'm going to find the way around it. But it's hard for a lot of people. They don't venture out and their comfort zone. They never stretch at all. And so they see a stop sign or a no everywhere they look. And they can't imagine a way around, through, or over, or they can't do the next step. For you have this like muscle memory around trying things from an early age. And I'm sure you have just as many stories of things not coming to fruition, but you still learned a lot, and you got probably further than most people would who won't try at all. I mean, first of all, you absolutely got further than people who won't try at all. You also have this like remarkable journey. You're in your, so how old are you in college? I'm trying to imagine you in the Model UN. Are you like mid-20s? Like when you say you went back at an older age?
Mid-20s.
Yeah.
Mid-20s.
So you're like in a grad school
time.
level, like you're grad student level age, but you're in an undergrad. You have access to all these resources. You're taking them full advantage, which a lot of times when you're a younger, like college student, you may not take advantage of all those things because you don't yet know what you want to do, or you don't care that much. You don't understand the relevancy. And so for you, like to be an older, quote unquote, older student, returning student, whatever you might call it. And now you're like, I'm going to do Model UN, and I'm going to be one of the 2 students talking to the entire like college administration. And like, I'm going to take 12 students to Cuba. Oh my gosh. When did you get into any kind of career path that felt right? Or is that like, did you have a career that was like a more corporate-y or like day job kind of thing before you went into sort of more of the entrepreneurship? Or have you always been dabbling in entrepreneurship?
I've always been dabbling, and my thing is that I started out like a lot of the fuel for my fire was about helping other people. It wasn't that I was looking for any kind of accolade of any kind. I was just like, well, let's just see what we could do here. And, and so what was really appealing to me, like in the corporate structure, I really liked more scrappy, like the startup mentality. And I believed, here's the thing, Robbie, is I read a ton of business books, and I like Good to Great. And I believed that every company wanted to perform like that, which is not true. There's a lot of resistance once you get inside of companies. They're like, why would I remember having a colleague, like I was working for a startup, and it was a more mature startup, and we were having a consistent problem with an issue. And I had a colleague, and I was like, I don't understand why you're not registering this and letting people know that this is a problem. And you know what she said to me? She said, if we fix it, will I still have a job?
Whoa.
And that was a really powerful moment for me to reflect back why people don't take initiative, right? And I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people don't take initiative, but it's also, I was like, I truly believed we were trying to make something better. And by her holding it back, I was offended by her behavior, And so I didn't understand why we weren't trying to fix things that were so obvious. And I also really got tired of being the one that was surfacing that, because sometimes you have a target on your back when you're the one that's like willing to call it out or have that brave conversation. We talk about being vulnerable, we talk about elevating things, but that makes other people incredibly uncomfortable. And at some point it started to wear on me, and I was like, oh man, I don't know if I can do this anymore. But I was conflicting with my own personal values by not saying things and not elevating them. And so, I really like the startup model. Now as an entrepreneur, I think of myself more like a solo entrepreneur, where I'm more comfortable. I'll be the one, I'll come in and say the things that your employees are already telling you, but nobody's listening. Right. And, be a consultant that comes in and says, okay, here's what you should do. And they're like, oh my God, that's such a great idea. And it's like, well, I'm sure there's somebody here that's been telling you this, but nobody listens. And
My mom always said, if you are the outside speaker and you bring luggage, right? Like if you're the traveling speaker, the traveling consultant, you're going to get paid more and listened to more. Like that was something she said to me a long time ago. And it's true, because when I was within an organization, I was a long time in nonprofits, and I was being hired by other nonprofit boards to teach them and train them. But my own nonprofit board, maybe like 3.5 years later, they let me come and do a presentation. And it was like kind of a like restricted, like what it was going to be. Like it was a little like, well, tell me again how. Whereas like all these other organizations were like, yes, teach us everything. Teach us everything. But because I was there all the time, I'm not special. And it's like, you're not the expert, right? You're just like an internal employee. So
what is that saying, familiarity breeds
yeah,
contempt, right?
yeah, you're
And
just like, oh yeah,
like they take it for granted, right?
right.
And I think they do a disservice, right? Because we spend all this time like finding really great people, and then we don't really listen to their greatness,
Right.
right? Like I think one of the things that I respect about myself now looking back is that I never gave up. Like, you can give up, I'm not going to give up. I'll go find somebody else who's going to listen to me, So I always had a side hustle or something else going on the side. And oftentimes it was bigger than my actual job, So for instance, I'm like working at a startup, and then I got my TEDx opportunity, and I was like, you guys, like, can you believe this? And I got no love for that at all. And, and it's an opportunity of a lifetime. And so I start looking at how can I celebrate the people closest to me, and how can I draw out their greatness. And I had a really good, this woman I've known for years and years and years. And we reconnected, and so she was doing at the time, Capital One was doing these like money work with a personal coach about your money beliefs and money systems and stuff like that. It's a value add that they were offering. I don't know if they still have it, but you could go into their offices and work with a coach 3 times. And I was like, well, let me sign up for that. And then they asked me to review it, and I said, honestly, I'm so sad that I can't do this with my friends, right? Like, I want to do this in community with my friends so that they learn. And And so we pitched it to Capital One, and we put together a pilot. And so we did a 6-week thing where we were talking about money for 6 weeks. And I pulled together all the people, I curated all but two or three people that were in the group. And afterwards, one night, this woman said to me, she said, "You're a really great leader." And my eyes just went doink, doink. Like, what are you talking about? I was just, up until that point, I was just doing things, right? Just doing things. And she's like, "Traca, you don't know you're a leader?" And I didn't. I honestly didn't. And then I started to reflect on that over the course of the week and started to notice the evidence of that. And then I was like, me not knowing I'm a leader feels really irresponsible. Like, how do I become the best leader? If I'm going to lead, how do I become the best leader that I possibly can? And her little offhand comment just shaped the entire trajectory of my how I went forward from there.
Now, even before that realization, you were already consuming like Zig Ziglar sales tips right in the back of the room. You were reading Jim Collins' Good to Great. How did you get introduced? I mean, obviously the Zig Ziglar thing, I understand the context, but how did you introduce to other leaders like that and people who were writing about those kinds of those to us that it's like foundational concepts of how to be a good leader and how to run a good business and how to think about the world differently. Where did that introduction or education come from?
So I'm glad that you asked that. Zig Ziglar has this concept. He calls it a mobile university. And he's like, anytime you're in a car, don't listen to the radio. Like, what are you listening to? And back in the day, they used to sell cassette tapes and send them to people's houses and all this kind of stuff, right? And I took that very seriously. And at one point when I was doing shoe sales, I was probably like 20, 21. I was the manager of a store that was about 45 minutes from my house. And I would listen to tapes on the way there and back every single day. And I would, and then I, how you get into a good interview and you stay in the car parked so you can listen to the thing and keep listening. And so that has been a lifelong habit of mine. And I was so glad when podcasts became really popular because I consumed podcasts like crazy. And one of my friends, her name, so at one point I was really invested in the culinary world. And one of my friends is a James Beard award-winning author, and she told me, she's like, where the good stuff is in a book? It's in the back. Circle all the names and then go find who they drew their resources from. And that's what I do. All my books have I'm circling names, and then I'll go and I'll often reach out to them on LinkedIn or I'll leave a review for them, and then they'll be like, "Who is this person?" And that's how I became friends with authors. Is they would or I'd follow up with questions or something, but I was always looking for who shaped who you are. And what is currently shaping who you are, and how can I jump on that train? So like you and Dory Clark, I went down a Dory Clark rabbit hole like nobody's business for years. And I love her so much. And she has just really pioneered the possibility of reinvention and what it looks like, and she opens up her playbook in a lot of ways, and so I think it's really beautiful.
So easy to go down a Dory Clark rabbit hole.
For sure.
It really is. She's amazing. We'll put links to all the people we're mentioning here in the show notes. I'll make sure at the end. And it also, this makes sense as to why I've noticed you and I, before we knew each other personally, we had a lot of people in common, and it's like you reaching out. I want to give a shout out actually to Pay Robbins, my virtual assistant, because she has made a habit that because she listens to and does show notes for every one of these shows, and if she likes a guest, like and she's not already connected to them, she has gone out and like really reached out and scheduled calls and paid for their or taken their free offer, or like paid to be in a course or something. Like she has very much stayed engaged. That same thing you're talking about, like she could just be a person who just like does the minimum and just processes the show notes. But because it's a topic she cares about, one, the show notes are so great. And two, she then is giving me suggestions for guests, because she'll say, oh, when I was listening to this person, they mentioned this other person, and then I went and watched their thing and they're really great. Like, so it's like you could at any point in your life choose to be more curious and to follow that curiosity wherever it goes, and like actually seek out those introductions. One thing I did to build my network, because you're sort of tapping into that part of my brain now, is in the beginning of the pandemic, I started thinking about how I could position myself as a Zoom, go-to person in a world where everyone was suddenly an expert. And I was looking at who was writing articles in all of the high-profile publications on Zoom, or just virtual content, virtual events, virtual meetings. And if I thought it was a good article, I was sharing it. But before I shared it, I would reach out to the author on LinkedIn with a connection request, tell them specifically what I liked about their article, and that I was going to be sharing it in a few days. And then I would tag them. And often these people, almost all of them, accepted my connection request. And some of them then commented on the thing. And I also got invited to be interviewed and like quoted for articles in like Inc. and Forbes, because I made that entry. And so suddenly I'm playing in a very different field than people who are like on, I don't know, Upwork, talking about how they know how to use Zoom. And I don't mean to disparage people on Upwork, but like it's a very different thing when you're being paid by the hour versus you're being quoted as a thought leader on something that's this like emerging world. Like, and it was like an open landscape. Anyone could step forward. And I feel like you're constantly finding those open spaces and stepping forward. And if they're not already there, you're creating them. Tell me a little bit about curiosity conversations, because I noticed you're one of the people I tend to read your posts. They pop up in my feed. Therefore, like my algorithm knows I like them, and I'm reading them to the end. And I keep hearing about how, LinkedIn people are like, oh, 20 words or less, 12 words or less, no picture. Yes, picture, not a long, it's like whatever. And you're like, I'm going to write a story. Tell me how that got started, and what has come of this, like these, I feel like they're observational stories of your life that like I'm so drawn in. How did that get going?
Well, thank you. So I ran a blog for 10 plus years, and called Seattle Tall Poppy. And I would, interview chefs, and I would interview photographers, and I would interview anybody related to the food industry. I interviewed a guy that had a buffalo farm, and I thought, like, how does this work? It's like amazing, right? By the way, buffalo are very vicious, and they kill more people a year at Yellowstone than any other animal combined. And they can jump 6 feet from a standing position. So
Things I did not know.
Right? But that was me getting curious, and I was like, who buys your product? And he's like, oh man, we have a shortage of buffalo because like athletes use it. It's got a high protein content. And then later, when I became a personal chef for a former Olympian, I was like, hey, we need to get some buffalo. I mean, it was just like, so again, curiosity, right? But then for me, what happened is I retired. I wanted to stop blogging because it felt like, like a pay to play kind of a situation where I was getting asked to do a lot of stuff, and the joy had left for me. So but I was like, I still like talking to people. And I went back to my friend Crescent, who I would mention earlier, and I said, hey, listen, if I stop blogging, will people stop talking to me? Like, I used my blog as the carrot for the reason that people would talk to me. And and it was basically free PR, because I just made them look really good, and it got on the algorithm and all this kind of stuff, right? And she said, yeah, they'll probably stop talking to you. Like, well, why would they want to talk to you? And I was like, let me test this theory. And so I started talking to everybody, and like before, when I had my blog, I carried a big SLR camera with me every single day. And I finally like stopped carrying that thing around. I finally like, but I didn't stop having conversations, but and at one point I was taking the bus and I was like, we're all going to the same place, like, or ultimately what else do we have in common? So I started talking to people on the bus, and then one day I had this amazing conversation and I didn't have my notebook with me, and I was like, I can't forget this thing that just happened. So I wrote it on Facebook and I meant to mark it private, and I didn't. And when I look back on Facebook later, people were like, mind blown. What just happened there? And so it started off as bus stories. I would meet people on the bus or commuting to work. And I mean, like, if you live in a big enough city, like, executives are on the bus as well as like the person that lost their mind. It could go any direction. Like, it's the biggest leveler of humanity if you live in a big enough city. And then I was like, okay, well, I studied documentary photographers for a while, and one of the things that they do is they have a pet project that they like, no matter if you shoot food or whatever and you have a thing for rodeos on your spare time, you'll go shoot rodeos. And so I was like, well, what's my pet project? And at the time I had read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, and there's a chapter in her book on negotiations. And I was like, I think I'm terrible at negotiations. Let me figure out how I can get better. And there weren't a lot of books on that subject. This was before Chris Voss, his book came out, and shortly before his book came out. And so I made it a pet project. I interviewed over 100 of the top negotiators in their field. And I was very broad about that, like who the number one real estate agent, the number one, like the author of the, some of the books that were out there, like, people that negotiate sports contracts. I just like, hey, how do you do this? How do you get better? What's your secret thing? What's one of your favorite stories? And so that turned into be a really pivotal thing. I started doing workshops because I was like, I can't keep all this goodness to myself. And I was like, and so, I only did like, I don't know, 3 or 4 workshops, but people came back to me, and I can personally track over $2 million worth of bonuses and pay raises as a result of those programs. And it was so exciting, right, to see people take that information and actually leverage it. And so, yeah, so that's kind of where it started. And now I'm just, and also, like, at the time I was, so I went from random to more specific, like topic generated curiosity conversations, like who do I want to learn from, what's going on. And so now I'm really interested in personal journeys, like how do you actually get past yourself, like the neuroscience of things is very interesting to me. And also people who have the courage to do stuff that I haven't even done yet, like, oh, like that's a limiting belief of mine. So like, what makes you think you could do that? How did you do that? What was your playbook? How did that all come about? And as you know, you and I are both in the National Speaker Association, and I'm starting to do more public speaking. And that was another thing. It's like, how do I get good at this? Like, what's the business infrastructure behind that? How do I become a better actual speaker? What do my assets need to look like so that people can find me? That kind of thing. And I'm still in build mode on that, but following the curiosity thread, it's just always been really fun.
Yeah, and we mentioned Dory Clark earlier, and Dory similarly wants to learn a thing, goes and talks to 50 people on that topic. Like, I'm thinking of her book, Entrepreneurial You, where she interviewed 50 people who each had a very specific revenue stream that they were known for. And these were not revenue streams that she necessarily had any, background or interest in or hadn't even thought about. And then she'd go find them and then find out how they made that happen. And I remember reading that whole book and just being like, oh, I could do this. Oh, I could do this. Oh, I could do that. Like it was like a smorgasbord of possible revenue streams for an entrepreneur. And, she takes all that and publishes these into books and then turns them into talks. So I am kind of keen to hear where you're going next, because I feel like you gather a lot of information and could easily follow in her footpath, which is how she sort of elevated her game. Like, she also now writes for high profile publications similar to your blog, because she's constantly writing and pitching articles. If she meets somebody and wants to like do something with them, it's really easy to find what's the right platform to then share that message. And then sometimes that also ends up in a talk or ends up in a book. It's like that desire to learn and to share what you learn. It's not just like you wanting to learn how to negotiate better, but that you were compelled to then share that. And I'm just so curious, like you are constantly meeting people. In this podcast, I talk about how we have sort of our inner circle group people, the people we know we're going to stay in touch with. We don't have to worry about it too much. But then there's like the second and third layers or tiers out, the people that you might see once a year at a conference, or maybe you worked with them 5 years ago and you haven't had a reason to stay in touch. These are people that you like, they like you, like these are people you enjoyed spending time with. How do you think about nurturing and sustaining those sort of wider parts of your network? Do you have any habits, philosophies, or practice for staying in touch?
Well, it's something that I'm always working on getting better at. But as you know, you and I are connected on Facebook, and that is, it's kind of like reading my diary some days, and it's interesting how people have like they may not comment, they may not say anything, but they are, when I connect with them, they are 100% up to date on everything about me. Like, and so I think that has been a really, a lot of people poo poo on Facebook, but I find it's been a really great asset for me to be able to stay in touch. And my thing is, it's a little bit one-sided, and I don't really care for that so much, because other people don't share as well, or they don't share like some of their learning journeys, like the things that they're learning are more important to me. So as an example, I have a friend of mine that she's super smart. She's like has pointed me to she's a source for some of the best resources that I ever have come across, and yet she'd rather talk about her dog, and I was just like, I don't understand why you're not sharing this good stuff that you're learning about. But I don't understand what's going on there, but I'm privileged to have a one-on-one relationship with her, so I'll like go out and learn all I can that she gave me, and then I'll come back for more. Okay, what else you got? Okay, I did that, like now what? But as far as keeping in touch with relationships, I'm also a big I'm a verbal processor, so I handwrite cards. I send I don't know, maybe 100 cards a year, maybe even more. I always, if I get a chance, I'll review somebody's book on Amazon. I'll leave a comment that is I'll try and be super thoughtful. I would say that one of the things that is a guiding principle for me is I've experienced some end of life death related things, and I think about that all the time. Like, this person made a huge impact on me. Do they know it? And did I express it? And if I haven't, and I'll do a mental check with, like, if somebody pops into my mind that was like really influential, like the person who said, you're a leader, that, right? She absolutely knows how much she touched my life by that. And I tell her that frequently. And even though we don't talk very often, she absolutely knows that. And I think that that's something that is really important, that if I were going to pass along to people, the people that touched your life, don't be shy about telling them that. And I'll give you an example of something, how that really served me recently. Is my father passed away, and I inherited his house in Florida, and I was in I had to get insurance for the house, and the insurance provider, not the main insurance company, but the provider kept saying the house is in a flood zone. And they wanted me to pay $3,000 upfront for insurance. And I didn't have $3,000, but I also was convinced it was not in a flood zone, that we were just seeing the information differently. And at one point in one of my various jobs, I used to have to pull reports on properties to determine whether they were in a flood zone. And I was like trying to figure out, like, hey, can I get a membership to this website in order to pull it? How do I do this? And it was commercial purposes only kind of thing, and I got roadblocked. And so finally I called the company I worked for back in 2001, and there were people still there that I worked with, and I said, hey, you know what, I'm having this huge problem, can you pull me a flood report? And they're like, I don't know that I have authority to do that. So they went to the CEO, who was one of my former bosses, who's still there. And she was like, of course. And don't you even think about charging her for that.
Amazing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was really cool that, and one of those people that I was in that chain we're connected on Facebook. She's following me along for the last 20 years. Like, I'm so proud of you, that kind of thing. And we haven't really talked since then, but I think that's been really powerful.
I think that you're a great example of how you can broadcast like your life in a way that allows people in and gives them something to talk to you about when they do talk to you. And if you reach out to them, it doesn't feel like it's 20 years, which is why they're more like your name is familiar to them. That's staying sort of present, if not top of mind, but staying like on the edges of people's stages. But I also imagine you as a convener of people. So how have you brought people together, and what does that look like in your life?
Oh, that is one of my favorite things to do. Like, I believe, so a friend of mine has this concept about the democratization of information. And that is one of the things that I hold really true, is that I love bringing people together. So during COVID, I would have fireside chats. I created a mastermind. I have run, so I was really into food. And at one point I was reviewing cookbooks all the time. And so I was like, it's going to take me 12 lifetimes to cook through all of these and do any justice to them. So I started what's now, it's a thing in the foodie world. It's called Cook the Book. And so it's a book club based on cookbooks, and it's a potluck. Come to the party with a dish that you made out of the cookbook that I assign. And we have a party. And that went on every month for 7 years. And then, like, I'm here in Mexico now, and I was like, who are all the people that are here? I'm going to start throwing like community parties at a restaurant or something like that. And I did 2 of them already this year. The first one had 20 people, and the next one had 30 people. And then now I run into people on the street, and they're like, when's the next one? And what I did is I created conversation cards, because when we gather, I think this is important. When we get together, what kind of conversation are you having? What are you even talking about? If you're talking about something dumb and meaningless, you've wasted an opportunity. And I think people don't know how to have good conversations when they have an opportunity. So I created these cards. Like little prompts. And then I went around the room like, what did you learn? What was the best tip you got today? What was your favorite thing? Like, where do you like to go? And so I just, I think that that's the other thing, is when we have conversations, how do you not blow it? How do you actually have like something so meaty that you're reflecting on it the next day or the day after? And I do want to share this one thing, right? Like, so I have a really good friend of mine who we used to talk about restaurants all the time. I was, big in the foodie world. And so we would talk about restaurants. We would go to restaurants, talk about the chef, talk about dishes and all this other kind of stuff. And at the time I was really trying to get my financial house in order. And about 5 years into our relationship, I realized that he was a tax ninja. Like that was just a passion project of his. I was so mad at him. I was like, why are we talking about all these dumb things when you actually have something that you could change my life? You have a knowledge that could literally change the course of my trajectory, and you didn't think it was worth talking to me about? I'm like, I'm offended. What kind of friendship do we have? And that changed everything. Like it changed everything. He's like, all right, what did you do this month? Where were your bills? What is,
Yeah, no, it's true. We all have this like untapped set of information. You're talking about the democratization of knowledge, and I think about the philosophy of abundance. Like I'm a sharer. If I give away my time or money, there's less of that. But if I give away knowledge, it just creates endless possibilities. And I also want to say that I for me, I feel like I have my coaching hat on, my business growth strategy hat on. I see multiple revenue streams in what you're describing. Like, first of all, why are those conversation cards not out in the world? And as an example of that, I'm going to point out my friend Jan Keck created Ask Deep Questions. It started out that he was going on a camping trip and they were all carpooling, and he didn't want the conversations in the cars to just be like mundane and people didn't know each other. So he created a bunch of questions for them to ask each other. And he's like, I couldn't be in all the cars. So I wanted this to happen in the other cars that I wasn't in. And then people loved them so much they use them the entire trip. And now it's a product he sells. And I'll put a link in the show notes. So I just think you have so many ideas that could be really helpful to other people. So the same way you were like to your friend, why are you not sharing this? I'm like, Traca, why are you not sharing this? We're about to go to my favorite wrap-up question. I wish we can keep going, but we're going to take a quick pause for a word from our sponsor. All right, so I know we're not going to lose touch. I know that you're in the Content and Connection Club, and if anyone wants to know about the Content and Connection Club, just email me or message me and to say I want to know more about this club. We meet every Friday. We do a mastermind. We've got co-working hours. We do a business book club. We've got a lot of fun stuff. Contentandconnectionclub.com if you want to check that out. I know we're not going to lose touch, but a year from now, if you or I were to remember that it's been a year since we had this recording, I want to know, what are we going to be celebrating for you? What are you most looking forward to in the year ahead?
That's a great question. The honest truth is that 2024, I'm trying to figure out how to break $1 million. I was really, so you come from the nonprofit world and service, and sometimes being in that role means you're broke. And I was like, how can I actually be of service and not be broke? And quite honestly, I've got some catching up to do. Like if I ever want to think about retirement, I need to make up for all those years where I was just being generous, doing my thing, not worried about money, all that kind of stuff. And so this year is what the past year I've been kind of like teeing up, like, okay, well, what would it look like, if I had $1 million and then I could invest that for the future, then I can go on to other pleasure projects and stuff like that. So this year is it's all about kind of teeing up, like not being ashamed about driving revenue. And what does that look like? So as what you were talking about, yes, I could make curiosity conversation cards. I could do all these things, but like, where am I going to get the biggest bang for my buck for the effort that is involved? And those are some hard choices. Like normally I would go for the cards, and that's not something I'm ruling out, but is that the biggest bang for the buck to get me to this end goal? So, they're all choices.
Kudos to you, and I will be here cheering you on and supporting you and congratulating you as you hit those milestones. My word of the year for 2020 was revenue, which at first felt like a slap in the face because I ended up with no job very quickly. My business was like all that in person, and it wasn't going to be about that. But by the end of the year, I had made as much in 2020 as I had the previous 5 years, where I was really just like building the business and hitting all the like the things you don't get paid for, like the TEDx and the book and the podcast, the things that sometimes cost you money. And then it just grew
Yeah.
from there. And so the following year, my word of the year was profit, because there's a difference between revenue and making money that you get to keep. And so I was really interested in my profit. And then the year after that, it was hobbies, because I needed to learn how to work less. And my word of the year for next year is ease, because I'm like all about making money, but like I'm focusing on like you said, like what is the pathway where people are just going to gravitate towards me, and the fit is so clear that I can help them, that they're like, yes, we want to pay you money. We want to get your support. So I wish that for you as well. The ease of figuring out the best path forward to that $1 million. And I know that as you figure it out, you will also be sharing, because that's who you are in all your curiosity conversations. This has been a really fun conversation. I'm so glad that we finally sat down to do this. How can people find you and follow your work?
That's a good question. I will be boosting LinkedIn is probably the best place right now. And I'm on Twitter. And as you had mentioned, I have a TEDx talk that I think is, it's been really powerful for a lot of people around the world. And, I would just love it if people would, tap that and figure out how to have better conversations.
Yeah. So, folks, if you do go to the show notes at ontheschmooze.com, you're going to find the LinkedIn, you're going to find the TEDx talk. When you go to the TEDx talk, of course, watch it, like it, and please leave a comment. Like, I'm just was realizing I had left a comment yet. And I do feel like that matters, because then more future viewers see it and realize, like, wow, this is a very powerful talk. So, thank you for doing that. Again, go to ontheschmooze.com for all the show notes. Thank you so much, Traca. This has been a great conversation.
Been a blast. Thanks, Rob.